So, honest confession, I love a good podcast. I'll even take a mediocre podcast. Um, I'm often doing stuff in around the house, like cooking or cleaning and that sort of thing. And I enjoy listening to something. And while sometimes, of course, that is an audiobook, when it isn't, it's a podcast. And there are certain podcasts that I follow fairly regularly, some that I follow very regularly, at least one or two that I am completely addicted to and have listened to in their entirety multiple times. Let me tell you all about them. So, I'm going to start with my favorite. I don't normally have favorites of things, but in this case, this is the one that I've gone back to again and again and listened to all of its episodes in full. I don't even know how many times now. And that is Ghosts in the Burbs by Liz Sauer. Now, she also has a blog version of this. In fact, my understanding is it began with the blog and then she started doing the podcast version of it, which she reads herself. And I discovered it during, as is honestly the case for a lot of these, in fact, really for podcasts in general. It's not that I'd never listened to a podcast before the COVID lockdowns in 2020, 2021, even into 2022, but I hadn't listened to them as much. But because I was working from home, doing everything from home, and I was still a lecturer at that point, and I live alone, so I had a lot of time on my hands to listen to things like that. I was busy. I was working. Contrary to popular myth, lecturers, professors, teachers generally, we were working like crazy trying to teach from home. But particularly that very first summer in 2020, there was more time to sort of do other work, trying to, where I wanted to listen to something. And I needed the company and I needed the mental release of just being told stories. And podcasts were a free and, easily available solution to that. And as soon as I realized that there were paranormal ones, horror ones out there, I was on it. And that was when I discovered Ghosts in the Burbs. It wasn't the first podcast of this sort that I'd come across, but it quickly became my favorite. And I think it's a fan favorite generally. She actually on iTunes, her podcast, Liz Sauer's podcast, Ghosts in the Burbs, gets a 4.9 out of 5. And it's such a cool premise. I mean, effectively, each episode is a first-person point of view short story where Liz herself is the main character. And these stories are predominantly set in Wellesley, Massachusetts, though occasionally she'll go sort of out of town and we'll get sort of different, out in the swells and things like that, where we are out of the swells rather, where we get stories from various places in and around generally New England. And one of the things that was most intriguing about these stories was that the way the podcast was structured, the way Liz tells the stories, where they are interviews with her haunted neighbors in the strange town of Wellesley, which honestly, I don't know what Wellesley's like. It is a real place. I've never been there. But it comes alive for you as this intensely, almost if not outright, dangerously haunted, strange, creepy place. And the way these interviews were structured, and I say, interviews, there was actually a degree of ambiguity. And while you knew these had to be stories, they had to be stories, there was just enough room for that little bit of, but what if they're not? What if this is the real deal? And it was so creepy. And there were certain episodes particularly once I had sort of caught up with the podcast, where there was this possible danger that was coming, and current events are very much, referenced in the podcast. So I caught up fairly quickly because I was listening to this thing obsessively. I was a couple of years behind, but when I caught up fast and I caught up hard. And, officially, Liz Sauer's podcast is cozy horror. But sometimes it really did chill, I think particularly maybe because the times were so strange, because even though I live in a very large village, there was something incredibly isolating about not being able to be physically around people, I don't know about other places, but certainly here in the UK, those first lockdowns in 2020, they were strict. They were very severe. And it was literally, as I say, I live alone. There were literally months that went by before we were allowed to, those of us who are single and live alone, were able to sort of bubble, as it were, create a safe bubble with a family. And I was actually able to start going over to a single friends, I mean, a family group of friends, and be physically in the same room with other human beings. It was literally months that went by. And even as an introvert, and I am an incredibly introverted person, believe it or not, that got hard. So podcasts like this one, so full of vivid characters, and of course, Liz herself, who as the narrator and as the primary character from whose point of view we're getting these stories, I felt like I got to know her and feel a great deal of affection for her. I would probably be far too familiar with her if she and I were ever actually to meet in person, because I just feel like I've known her for years now. So I'm going to stop gushing because I want to move on. I don't want this to be too long an episode. And believe me, I could talk forever about them. But just to say a little bit about her with her podcast. Just so you know, while most of the episodes are these interviews with the haunted neighbors, we do later on get her essentially doing audiobook versions for us of a couple of novels that she has written. One is called Lilith and the other is called Claire, and these come out of the interview short stories, and are sort of built upon, particularly Claire, who is and I won't say too much about Claire, I don't want to spoil it if you've never listened before, but she is a character who comes in very sporadically but becomes more and more crucial to the interviews and to Liz as a character's story. And so Liz Sauer, the author, has written a novel about Claire and sort of brought her together. She has also done a novel called The Cul-de-sac that she has read aloud in the podcast, and another which is officially fan fiction of Jaws called Thea. And she started one, Fatal Fall Fest, I don't know, a couple months ago, but hasn't done more with that since then. But she has released another interview, and honestly, I am thrilled. The novels are fine, particularly Lilith and Claire, but it's those interviews that are the closest thing to my heart. Nothing against the novels, and if you're listening, Liz, I love you. Nothing against your novels, but your interviews, your short stories, you've got a real gift there. So that's all I'll say for now about Ghosts in the Burbs. If you're interested in finding out more about Liz Sauer and her podcast, you can go to her website, ghostsintheburbs.com. That's GHOSTS, ghostsintheburbs.com. You can also support her via Patreon, so have a look. Now, the next podcast that I'm going to talk about, and this is one, it's an interesting one in that this is a factual interview podcast. Liz's interviews are with fictional characters, I assume, but Jim Harold's interviews for his podcast called The Paranormal Podcast, in which he says, at least according to what he knows, is the longest running and the oldest paranormal themed podcast available. I believe it's now getting up into its 19th or 20th year here. Um, these are interviews with people who have written books, with people who do ghost hunting and cryptid hunting, who study sort of UAP and UFO. UAP is unexplained aerial phenomenon. Um, it's meant to be a more umbrella and more specific term than UFO, unidentified flying object. So he is actually interviewing people, talking about real world experiences, talking about the research they've done for various books they've written, and so forth. And it's just really, really interesting. And while I won't say that every episode that comes along is my thing, because we all have different interests in these areas, even occasionally when one isn't quite what I would normally want to listen to, or a subject I was myself especially interested in, I still enjoy the interview, and I will more often than not listen. Occasionally I've skipped an episode, but it's very unusual. Now, this is the thing though, if you are interested in the Jim Harold podcast, Paranormal podcast, and you see an interview that looks interesting, listen to it right away, because while he has usually about 8 or 9 episodes, 10 episodes available for free on wherever you listen to your podcasts, at some point they do go behind a paywall. Now, of course, if you are interested, you can subscribe, and that gives you all, I don't even know, hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of back episodes of the Paranormal podcast. I am not personally in a position to be able to do that at the moment. I have other priorities that I need to use for my money, my spending. But it's a great podcast, and if you can afford to support, Sauer has a Patreon. Jim Harold has his spooky studio, and I would recommend, if this is your cup of tea, and you can afford to do so, support these creators, because they work very, very hard. And my understanding is that the world of the podcast is changing, in particular how it operates from a business perspective. So, go for it if you can. But if you can't, there are a number of episodes that are there freely available to be listened to. And my advice is, as I say, if you see one that really grabs your interest, go ahead and listen to it sooner rather than later. Jim Harold's website is, perhaps unsurprisingly, jimharold.com. You can look out for Paranormal Podcast. He has other podcasts. Join his Plus Club, where you can have more access to the past episodes. Support these people. When you can support creators, you should. And speaking of supporting creatives, if you like what you're seeing here, be sure to like this episode, subscribe to my channel, share this or any other episodes with friends or family that you think might be interested. It really helps support me, helps me keep being able to do this. Right. The next podcast that I'd like to talk about is, my Lord, a hugely successful podcast, and a very rapidly successful podcast. This one, Uncanny, by Danny Robbins. Now, this is not Danny Robbins' first podcast, but it is absolutely his runaway monster hit. And this one is a little different compared to some of the others, because Danny Robbins wants this to be a sort of more interactive podcast. He will run various sort of listen along live episodes where people can sort of message each other while listening to the episode on social media. But even beyond that, he makes available contact information through the BBC. This is a BBC Sounds podcast. And he will read out in the next, in subsequent episodes, fan theories and ideas, listener theories and ideas about what we're hearing. And of course, the thing with what Danny Robbins is doing in Uncanny is he is interviewing someone who has lived through some kind of haunting or paranormal event, And we're hearing it in their own words. We get a description of him, and a lot of people really love the way Danny describes his interviewees. And then, he talks, we hear discussion from, or we hear the story from the person who experienced it. We get a discussion with them about this from Danny. And then we get people who are experts, various experts, weighing in, always one from a more skeptical point of view, one from a more sort of believer's point of view. I don't always like this term because we hear a lot on Uncanny about, are you team believer or team skeptic? And it's almost as if skeptic means I don't believe. Skeptic doesn't mean a lack of belief. If you don't believe in ghosts, you are a non-believer. If you're not sure, if you don't just automatically believe it's a ghost, but you want to think about, well, what else could it be? And it might be a ghost, but it might not be. That's a skeptic. And so sometimes I think the way people mean skeptic in these kinds of discussions is they mean they don't believe. And there's a real reluctance from most of the skeptics who come on to weigh in on these discussions as to, they aren't really skeptics, they're non-believers, at least as they present themselves. Who knows? But it's a great podcast. It's really well worth listening to. There have been a number of seasons now. I think about 4 seasons, or are we on our 5th season now here in 2026? Where right now we're listening to Uncanny Cold Case, where these are older cases that are unsolved, paranormal cases that he's delving into. But while most of these are paranormal in the more sort of typical modern, narrower sense of the word, ghosts, possible demonic presences, poltergeists, psychokinesis, those kinds of things, we do sometimes get that slightly broader, more old school approach to the definition with UFOs and UAPs. So things like, for instance, the Rendlesham Forest accounts and those sorts of things. But yeah, well worth listening to. And if you like Uncanny, you actually might like even more, because honestly, I like even more, Danny Robbins' first paranormal themed podcast, Haunted. This is another one I came across during the pandemic, the first year in 2020, but it was actually launched in 2017. So I missed it, but I came to it and was able to listen to all 11 episodes in full, and sort of binge it. That's the word. I was able to just sort of binge it, and it's a very similar format. We don't get the kind of audience participation side of this. We just get the interviews with people who have experienced these events, and Danny Robbins discussing it with them, and maybe with some kind of an expert. But it's a much more straightforward telling, and it doesn't have the degree of sensationalism that I think sometimes Uncanny, especially as it has evolved, can sometimes take on. It gets a little bit too, I don't want to say too showbiz. That's not fair. That's not right. But it gets a little bit more dramatized with Uncanny than you get with Haunted. Haunted is a little bit more straightforward, a little bit simpler, and I really appreciate that. Now, he has done a couple of other standalone podcasts, The Witch Farm and The Battersea Poltergeist. Both of them are very good. I particularly have to admit, of those two, I prefer The Battersea Poltergeist, but The Witch Farm is interesting as well. These are multi-episode deep dives into a single paranormal event, a single haunting, and are really, really interesting. And I do enjoy that going that much more in depth. Now, if you like Danny Robbins, you might want to check out his books as well. He has 2 books published. The first one, Into the Uncanny, I have read it. It's really good. It's very similar to an episode of Uncanny, quite frankly, or to multiple episodes, sort of different ones in each chapter. And it does sort of give you a bit more sort of of his approach to his interest in where he's coming from in wanting to explore these topics. And he also has a book that's aimed more at the child reader audience, which I have not myself looked at, but which actually looks really interesting, really good, called Do You Believe in Ghosts? So go and have a listen to, especially haunted, but uncanny as well. Battersea Poltergeist, and The Witch Farm, of course, for honorable mentions from the Danny Robbins world. And of course, it's not a podcast, but I've got to mention his play, 222, A Ghost Story. I saw it when it came to my local theater a couple years ago. Loved it. Really good story. That's all I'll say. And speaking of series long deep dives into a single case or phenomenon or whatever, I have to give a lot of love to my favorite of Aaron Mahnke's podcast. Now, Aaron Mahnke, of course, is another major powerhouse in the world of paranormal and supernatural podcasting. Um, and I will, of course, say something about lore, which I am a fan of, although I have to confess it's been a while since I've listened to it, but I do still have a really soft spot in my heart for it. But it's actually his podcast, Unobscured, that is my favorite of Aaron Mahnke's podcasts. This is, I guess, in a way, it's a spin off of lore, but we only have 4 seasons of it. And each season is a long deep dive into, multi-episode deep dive into a specific topic. And the episodes where we have the sort of official podcast are then followed on in the season with bonus episodes where essentially what we're getting is the raw footage of Mahnke's assistants interviewing the usually academic experts who are quoted throughout the various episodes. Often people who are published experts on the topic that's being explored, or an individual related to or part of the story of that topic. Season 1 is my I don't know. Seasons 1 and 2 are my favorites. I guess 1 especially. It is an exploration of the Salem witch trials, and is incredibly thorough in its approach, incredibly detailed, going back, sort of before all of this begins with the King Philip's War and so forth. And I mean, this is a series that when I've had students in the past, when I was a lecturer, wanting to do something related to witches or the Salem witch trials, I would always send them to this season of Unobscured and say, just listen to it. Listen especially to the bonus episodes, because it's such a rich source of information. And then, if you can find these books that the people who are being interviewed have written, go for it. But yeah, season 1, the Salem witch trials. Season 2, the spiritualist movement of the 19th, early 20th centuries, sort of beginning with the Fox sisters and moving forward. Season 3 is an exploration of Jack the Ripper, and all of that, the mystery and the possible theories and so forth around that one. And then season 4, the final season, is on Rasputin, Grigory Rasputin, who of course was the strange sort of holy man who becomes so incredibly and toxically influential in the court of Nicholas II of Russia. Mainly because Nicholas and his wife Alexandra believed that Rasputin was able to control their son's hemophilia. Obviously, an incredibly dangerous condition. And, this was them not being prudent monarchs, although there's a lot bad about Nicholas II as a monarch. This is them being parents desperate to keep their son alive. So it's, a very tragic tale in many ways. I mean, as is the story of the Salem witches, as is Jack the Ripper. So, yeah, have a listen to Unobscured. It is really, really worth it, especially if you are interested in those topics. And, it's done with such a simplicity, such an intelligence, that it is, it's not just fun to listen to. You learn an enormous amount, even as someone with a PhD in history who is interested particularly in the Salem witch trials and in the spiritualist movement, I still learned a huge amount. Right, so number 6 on my list. Apart from the very first one, these really aren't in any particular order. They're just the sort of order that I wrote them down in. And the 6th one, honestly, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed this this podcast, and it's only 3 seasons. Though who knows, they might do another one someday. I've not heard either way whether they will or won't. But this one is it's another from Aaron Mahnke's production company, Grim and Mild, and but this one is done by Toby Ball, and it's called Strange Arrivals. And this is UAPs, UFOs. Normally not something that I won't say I'm not interested in it. Of course, I'm interested in this kind of thing, in the way that I think many of us are interested. But it's not something that I follow avidly or anything like that. The season 1 is about the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Season 2 is about the Rendlesham Forest UFO sightings in the 80s. And season 3 is actually about a couple of different UFO investigators, Dr. John Mack and researcher David Jacobs. So Toby Ball's delivery as the narrator for this series is very similar in style to Aaron Mahnke, who is well known for this very almost dry, calm, undramatic retelling of stories or of events. And that's very much how Toby Ball does his own narration. And it's brilliant because rather than feeling the need to bring great drama to these incredible stories, they let the stories bring the drama for themselves, and they simply tell them. And it's incredibly effective, I find. I would always be someone who thinks you're better off underplaying than overplaying these things. And I mean, I will say, I again, I was surprised. I was genuinely surprised at how much I enjoyed these. I was drawn in by Betty and Barney Hill's story because I have heard it before, and it sounded interesting, to do this sort of season-long deep dive. And it was even more interesting than I thought it would be. And because I knew less about Rendlesham Forest when that season came along, I was there for it. I was totally interested. And honestly, because this is not a topic that is of specialist interest to me, as I say, I find it interesting. I do believe that there must be other intelligent life out there in the universe. I don't know how there couldn't be, statistically and otherwise. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed this series, how eager I was to come back for the next episode, when these were being still released over the course of several weeks. The series I knew the least about was the 3rd series about Dr. John Mack and researcher David Jacobs, because I don't know this area terribly well as a field of research and interest. And it was a genuinely amazing and illuminating subject discussion. Even though I enjoyed Barney and Betty Hill's story, even though I enjoyed Rendlesham Forest and that story, that 3rd season, because I knew the least about it, I found it the most intriguing in some ways. And this is, if you're really into UFO stuff, even if you've heard of these stories, even if you know these cases pretty well, I think it's still one that would interest you. I think it's still one that you'd get a lot out of. The tinfoil hat's not required, although apparently I saw a thing recently with Neil deGrasse Tyson saying there is actually science behind the idea of wearing the tinfoil hat, that, it could block certain things. But I'm not a tinfoil hat person myself, but I don't think that believing in the possibility of UFOs and UAPs is weird, crazy. I don't know whether humans have been visited, but I don't know that we haven't. And that's all I'm saying about that. But yeah, as I say, this is it's another Grim and Mild production. It's basically unobscured, but for UFOs and UAPs. So if that's your jam, come and listen to it. Number 7 on the list, another one from Grim and Mild. This one I really loved. Super, super creepy. The Hidden Jinn by Rabia Chaudhry. Um, it's so crazy that when this one came out, I had actually been to dinner at a friend's house just a couple of weeks before I heard about this podcast, and it had yet to debut actually, and we had just gotten to talking. These friends are Saudi Arabian, and we got to talking, and because I love paranormal stuff, and they know that, somehow or another the conversation moved along to the jinn, and sort of the legends and all. In the East in the West we tend to refer to these as genies, and we of course have several genie characters, from the genie, of course, in Aladdin, to include the Disney movie of Aladdin, or movies, because there's the live action as well. I Dream of Genie, who is a genie in a bottle, but a genie named Genie, and, various things like that. But that's nothing. That is nothing compared to the Middle Eastern lore around the jinn, who are this kind of parallel species who are like us, but not like us, whose existence is kind of, as I say, it's this parallel realm to where humans live. And it's just creepy. Some of them are perfectly benevolent, some of them are really evil. It's this whole mix of different personalities and emotions and interests and everything else. And they are powerful. And to hear this talked about by someone who grew up within cultures that do believe in the jinn, who talk about, or don't, because you're not really supposed to talk about them. Apparently, talking about them too much can summon one. So hopefully, I'm okay here. Hopefully, Rabia Chaudhry's okay after she did an entire podcast about them. But it is really chilling, really fascinating stuff. And honestly, it was like, there are so many things with the jinn that are, in the West, we would find in our folklore about elves, about fairies, and so forth. Um, even some things that relate to the way people talk now about how to spot AI. Watch the hands, watch the feet, watch the eyes, that kind of thing. That's how you can tell whether you got another human or something else. And yeah, I would say if you really love that kind of folklore, that kind of mythology, or not, who knows? But if this sort of thing interests you, definitely check it out. Again, where all good podcasts are available. The Hidden Gem by Rabia Chaudhry. Um, it's just the one season, but I'm not the only one to love it. This is another one that has been on iTunes given a rating of 4.9 out of 5. All right, so um, I'm going to finish off these. This is not the finish off of the list, but of the Aaron Mahnke ones by, of course, talking just a little bit about lore. This is the first of Aaron Mahnke's podcasts. This is the one that becomes the flagship from which all, Grim and Mild Productions and all of these other podcasts from his company that I've talked about have come. So The Hidden Gem, Unobscured, Strange Arrivals. There are others, but those are the ones that I personally have listened to and loved. And but Laura's the one that started it all, and has even had two short seasons of episodes, bringing some of the earlier podcast episodes to life, that were done on Amazon Prime, I think. And, in particular, the episode on Robert the Doll. Wow, that is creepy. Dolls are creepy. Okay, even as a child, I did not like dolls. Stuffed animals, those are fine. Dolls, totally different thing. But yeah, lore is it's so simply told, and the stories are so wonderfully laid out. And of course, I have to say something about probably although I love the stories and how Aaron Mahnke tells those stories, the music in Lore is just gorgeous. Its music is composed and I think performed by Chad Lawson, and I loved it so much. I've actually gone on to buy several of his albums, and his music forms very much the core of the kind of playlists that I have for when I'm doing my writing, because it sets the mood so beautifully and is such gorgeous music, and very macabre gothic, but absolutely beautiful in the way that so many gothic macabre things can be. So, with lore, you get this kind of crossover, of course, between history and folklore. And, lore is all about the intersections between those two things. And as a historian who absolutely adores folklore, you know, lore was very much my jam. And it's been a while, I have to confess. I got behind on it, and it kind of, I haven't gone back to it as much. Some of it has gone behind a paywall, so you would have to actually sort of sign up to their subscription in order to be able to access some of those earlier and arguably some of his most classic episodes. But there's still plenty of lore to love. So do check it out. It's one of the really great sort of folkloric, gothic, ghostly podcasts that are out there, and you won't regret it. If you like history and folklore, you have to go and check out lore. Okay? Now, all right, so number 9 on the list. This is the one I've discovered the most recently, but I've already watched a number of episodes from it. I haven't watched them all yet. Watched, I say, rather than listened, because I discovered this one on YouTube, and so that's how I've engaged with it. I do need to actually find and listen to it. And this is Highway to Hell by Monty Mader. Some of you may have heard of Monty Mader elsewhere because she's probably best known as someone who has escaped white Christian nationalism, deconstructed from that. She was raised within it, but deconstructed from it and moved away from it in her early 20s, and now spends a lot of time on platforms like Instagram and TikTok. And she has another podcast called Flipping Tables, where she talks about where white Christian nationalism is coming from, why it has the beliefs it has, why it pushes what it's pushing, and talks about, sort of how you can deconstruct from that, how she deconstructed from that, how others who might be listening who are in that world still would want to. And at the same time, this helps to explain what's going on with this group to those of us who didn't grow up within that, who don't share those beliefs. Because of course, we're at a point, unfortunately, in history where regardless of where you live in the world, you need to understand what these people's raison d'etre is, because it's going to impact all of us, if not already impacting many people. And I have huge respect for her. She's clearly an incredibly intelligent, thoughtful, erudite woman. But she's also in a band, a singer in a band, and, as it turns out, has a deep interest in the paranormal. And so Highway to Hell, I think, is a real labor of love for her from the sound of it. And in this podcast, she, the first, I think, 10 episodes, it's just her talking about various hauntings and so forth, and also pairing with those sort of proposed road trip itineraries, or in some cases, talking about the trips she herself has had. For instance, just the other day, I watched the episode that she did earlier on, and I watched it on YouTube, where she talks about a trip she took to Savannah. And, she does the dark tourism side of that, but also the restaurants, the cafes, the places to stay, all of that kind of stuff. In her discussion of the Bell Witch caves and the Bell Witch haunting, And in these later episodes, she's joined by her bandmate, Andy Jones. They talk about a proposed road trip itinerary leaving from where they live in Nashville, Tennessee, and heading out to where the Bell Witch Caves are. And she also does another one where she talks about Amityville and, the history of the land, the history of the haunting, and so forth. She and Andy discuss the stories and all connected with the haunting, and then talk about a proposed weekend trip to Amityville and where one might stay, the places to eat, the places to get your breakfast, your coffee, your tea, and, you know, all the other good stuff that's there to see. So this is a lot of fun, this episode. It's a bit like how the original Ghost Adventures episodes used to be, where the reason they were on the Travel Channel was they engaged in sort of tourism stroke dark tourism, and then also did paranormal investigation. She's not doing paranormal investigations, but she is talking about, you know, true hauntings and so forth, and the places that these stories take place. So it's a lot of fun. It's really, really interesting. Um, have a listen. It's, and this one, as I say, it's on podcast platforms, but it is also on YouTube if you want to watch her record the episodes for the podcast, which they film. Speaking of which, Jim Harold also does this. Some of the others may do. I know of a number of podcasts that have both a YouTube presence and a sort of traditional podcast platforms presence. So it's up to you how you engage with them. Honestly, there are podcasts outside of paranormal ones that I watch as YouTube programs, others that I listen to. It's whatever your preference is. If they're available on both, you can always switch back and forth. Um, but yeah, so last but not least, and this is a limited one. There are only 16 episodes, and only 13 of those. So that's most of them. So I said only, but 13 of the 16 episodes are the actual story. But this is a it is a nearly season long deep dive. Technically, those last 3 episodes were a second season, but I guess she just let it go. But this is a series called The Chilling, as in chilling, Chilling, The Chilling, and it's by Lindsay Brisbane of Little Fang Media. And I believe she is actually a photographer. I've seen some of her photographs online, and really, really beautiful, really cool photography. But in this podcast, The Chilling, she tells the story of a haunted house in Kent, Ohio, which has a long history as a haunting. She interviews people who've lived there at various points in the house's history, and she herself, along with 2 roommates, lived there when she was a student at Kent State University. And yes, it is that Kent State, the one that had the very infamous Kent State massacre, the shooting of various people, students and others, by the National Guard on the 4th of May, 1970. I think most people would recognize 1 or 2 photographs in particular from that have become these sort of iconic images from a very troubled time in history. And, she says, at the start of episode 1, or toward the start of episode 1, the truth is far more frightening than any fiction ever could be. She means that this is a scary, creepy, terribly fascinating podcast. And the way she talks about this house, the way she recalls her experiences and her, and she includes one of her roommates, I think both, but certainly one of her roommates, and others to actually tell their side of the story. It is simultaneously literary and cinematic. You can absolutely picture this house. You can imagine going through what they go through. It is a genuinely compelling story. And as I say, it is in large part compelling because one of those who lived through the haunting is the primary teller of this tale. So, those are my 10 favorite horror or paranormal themed podcasts of the moment. Some of them, well, really for more than a moment, most of them for a very long time. Most of them I've listened to repeatedly, or at least have listened, if they have huge numbers of episodes, I've listened to those certain episodes on repeat. Um, and I would encourage you, if you've never really engaged in podcasts, go check these out. If you have, but you've not heard of these, give them a shout. If you're a fan already of any of them or all of them, do let me know. I'd love to hear in the comments do you have any suggestions for podcasts that you think I should check out? Any podcasts that if I like these, I'll love whatever you're going to suggest. Please let me know. And yeah, that's all for this week. Thank you for coming along for the ride, and I will catch you next week with our new episode. See you later. Bye.